Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today for a joint workshop with the Boston Public Library and the Leventhal Map and Education Center, focusing on critical map reading in the age of misinformation. My name is Erica Husting, and I am the Journalism and Media Specialist here at the Boston Public Library. A lot of my work is teaching workshops that focus on various news and media literacy topics. And I'm here, and I'm thrilled to be here with the LMEC to talk about this topic where our two focuses collide. I'll turn it over to my co-presenter, Ian Spangler and Megan Nally for a quick introduction.
Thanks so much, Erica. Well, hi, folks. My name is Ian Spangler. I'm the Assistant Curator of Digital and Participatory Geography here at the Leventhal Map and Education Center. Megan, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself briefly before we dive in?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Erica. Hi, Ian. Hi, everyone who's joining us remotely. We're so happy to have you all here. My name is Megan. I'm the Public Engagement Coordinator at the Map Center. I do a lot of work with our current exhibition called Bending Lines, and today we're going to learn a little bit more about it. And for those who are local, it is up for one more day, so you should absolutely stop by the BPL tomorrow. Back to you, Ian.
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, we would be so excited to see you all tomorrow as we wrap up the exhibit, some of which we'll be talking about today. In a lot of ways, the key questions and issues that we're going to be going over here about map interpretation and media literacy have a lot to do with the kind of core motivating questions behind Bending Lines itself. I want to start off by taking note of some of the complicated and contested threads that are woven through all kinds of map interpretation and historical geography. That includes some difficult stories that we can neither can nor should ignore. The place that we call Boston today is the ancestral and current home of Indigenous people, including the Mashpee and Aquanawampanoag tribes, the Nipmuc nations, and descendants of the Massachusetts people. Copley Square, where the BPL is located, sits atop of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in North America. The maps that we have here in the BPL bear history not only to Indigenous expropriation, but also to other conflicts ranging from labor struggles to racial segregation. In many cases, the maps we have don't just document those stories, but they actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. And in all the programs that we host at the LMEC and with the BPL, we encourage people to think about how these histories are very much with us in the present day. Now, like I said before, the event that we've got set up for you today focuses very much on understanding maps as non-neutral communicative objects. And this idea that maps have a kind of inherent bias is at the core of our exhibition Bending Lines. So again, I encourage you to come check it out. We talk about a lot of this stuff in greater detail. And it's up for one more day, like Megan said, so don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions about it. With that said, Erica, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to you, and maybe we can get started here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ian and Megan. So before we dive into our topic today, just wanted to go over a few different housekeeping things. This is a live and interactive workshop, so we encourage any questions that you may have. We're also currently streaming this workshop on YouTube and Facebook, so hello to all of you who are tuning in on those platforms. On our end, we're going to have the chat feature up, so we'll be sure to take time throughout, and also we'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end where we'll get to the majority of the questions. Great. So if we could proceed to the next slide. Great. So just a quick agenda for our time here today. First, we're going to kick off our workshop today talking about what exactly is media literacy and why exactly we're here today talking about media literacy in regards to maps. Specifically within that conversation, we're going to be talking about when maps go viral, and why we need critical thinking skills when we consume maps we might see in the media and also on social media. Then when the stage is set, we'll turn it over to Ian, who will also explore considerations for critical map reading. We're going to then kind of conclude our presentation with some tips for reading maps and also verifying maps that you can take with you, hopefully, as you encounter maps in your day-to-day life. And then finally, we'll round it out, like I said earlier, with a Q&A session. So without further ado, let's dive in. So next slide, please. Great. So I wanted to first start off our conversation by providing a definition of what we mean when we say media literacy. This way we can have the same foundation of understanding as we move throughout this workshop. So this definition up on the screen is provided by the National Association of Media Literacy Education. And their definition notes that media literacy is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. If we could go one more slide. So going a little bit more granular, I wanted to kind of focus on what we mean by media. And so the organization, they describe media as all electronic or digital means and print or artistic values used to transmit messages. Maps are a form of media. And as the bending line exhibit highlights, every map is a representation of reality. And every representation, no matter how accurate and honest, does involve simplifications, symbolization, and selective attention. We're taking a 3D object and translating it into a 2D interpretation. So if we can go to the next slide. So when we talk about media literacy in regards to maps, we're talking about those critical thinking skills that can help us evaluate, synthesize, and analyze messages within the maps. I really liked this quote from the Bending Line exhibit, where they say, thinking carefully about motivations, meaning, persuasion, and presentation helps us to construct trust in an informed and critical manner. The visual language of cartography has its own grammar and vocabulary, and learning how to interpret this language is a crucial form of literacy in a world saturated with visual information. And also, I'd like to think that media literacy also extends not just with the media itself, but also understanding the environment that in which media circulates and is shared, which I'm going to be talking about now when we have our discussion of when maps go viral, especially on social media. So as mentioned, in the age of social media, as all of you might know and have been aware of, we see media go viral. And when I'm talking about when something goes viral, this is usually the rapid traction via dissemination on different social media platforms. And with this viral media, unfortunately, sometimes, and there are misinformation that gets shared. And misinformation has real life consequences and can do harm. We're going to be touching upon some of that today in some of our examples. Wrapping up this conversation, maps are no exception and can be used as vehicles of misinformation when they go viral. And why exactly is this? In an interview with Fast Company, Anthony Robinson, an associate professor of geography at Penn State, notes that there's this instinct to trust maps as fact. Additionally, in our media age, it can be really easy to make and share maps. And then you add in social media, which has this very frictionless ability to share with a click of a button or, a simple retweet or comments. And this can encourage people to share these maps and also receive engagement. So if we can go to the next slide. We're going to go over some examples here today. And I just want to say that, some maps that do go viral, are helpful, they're empowering, and can help us make sense of some complex data. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of the misinformation that gets shared on social media. And this can also help, I'd like to think, knowing how misinformation is spread can help you identify it when you are kind of consuming this different types of media. So this is our first example here. I'm going to give you a few seconds to take a look at it. This photo was shared on Twitter in October 2021 with the caption, scientists say that this map represents the US in 30 years if we don't reverse climate change. So sitting with this map for a little bit, some of you might have automatically noticed Italy is in the middle of the map. And then others might notice that the water placement within to represent the flooding might not make the most sense. And many Twitter users, when this was shared on social media, did automatically notice some of these manipulated elements of this map, but it didn't stop it from going viral. In fact, the week that it was shared, it was trending on the science topics on Twitter. And I took a screenshot of the original tweet, I think a few weeks ago, and at this point, it had over 23,000 likes, over 3,000 retweets, and over 10,000 quote tweets. So as you can see here, it got a lot of traction. And with a quick Google search, some people were able to trace back the original map to a blog that was published in December of 2015. So this was not a new map whatsoever. And it actually was, the title of this map in this blog was The Mediterranean Sea of America. And in a interview with Forbes, which we're going to drop that article in the chat in case you are interested in learning more about how this map went viral. The reporter had a conversation with the person who created the map, and he said that he had created the map after he went on vacation and was interested to see how the size of the Mediterranean Sea corresponded with that of North America. So as you can see here, this map trended for a completely different way than what it was intended. And this is one example of how fast a map can go viral on social media. If you could go to the next slide, Ian. Great. So the last two examples that I'm going to be going over were part of a larger conversation in an article from First Draft, and we're going to drop this one in the chat as well. It has really good analysis and kind of discussion around how in early 2020, a lot of maps went viral that unfortunately were very misleading. And so we're going to go over a few of those examples right now. So let's see here. This map that we see here might be familiar to some, as it went viral in the beginning of the pandemic in February 2020. And this went viral. It had a few contexts for where it went viral. Some people tweeting it said that it was showing how COVID-19 was spreading. Some said it was showing how COVID-19 might continue to spread. But they all traced back the source to this unpeer-reviewed study from World Pop Project at the University of Southampton in the UK. That example is on the bottom left-hand corner. And so they had used this map to accompany a tweet that promoted their study. And in fact, this map had nothing to do with the study whatsoever, and it actually was an old map that was from 2011 and mapped global air traffic routes for the entire year. When people started to they discovered it, I think, from a reverse Google image search too, and it quickly was deleted, but the damage had already been done. As you can see here in the bottom right-hand side, a lot of media outlets did pick up the image with the wrong context. And if we can just go to the next slide, as we can see here, this is an example of how misinformation can do a lot of damage. This quote from the article was from a global health expert at the University of Oxford, and their quote is, while social media users may be seeking reassurance, badly designed or misinterpreted maps risk worsening popular emotions like fear, panic, anger, racism, and discrimination. So let's go to the next slide here. So this is the final kind of image that we're going to be talking about here. This is an example of how sometimes when maps go viral, a map's intention gets misinterpreted. So this was around the Australian brush fires that happened in early 2020 as well. And the map on the right was created by an artist whose account you can see on the right-hand side. And it was mistaken for an aerial photo of presumably the fires. But in reality, the artist made this from hotspot data. And as you can see here, Rihanna shared this map as one example of how this went viral. She shared it to her networks that had over 96 million followers. The image spread so far and wide that the artist who created the image had to go on his platforms and say to people to not share it. And so this is another example. That kind of is setting the stage for kind of when maps go viral and how misinformation can get spread on social media. We'll be concluding by talking about some tips for verifying maps that you might find on social media similar to this. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to Ian, who's going to be talking about considerations for critical map readings and the maps themselves.
Thanks, Erica. Yeah, so I think that this is such a good segue because we've kind of had a chance to take a look at some maps that spread virally through platforms like Twitter, which is obviously a case where you can get a lot of these, whether it's a digital map, an old map, maps in the media that are hard to parse and move very quickly. What I'm going to be talking about here is some ways that you can approach these kinds of maps, and in particular, distinct things that you can look for on such a map to ask questions about whether you should trust it or not. And a key point that I want to make here in terms of big picture, bird's eye view considerations is that all maps have bias, but bias is value neutral. The maps themselves require different kinds of bias in order to be made, and that's what makes them powerful. Anyone can, make a map, right? Anyone can make a map like this, and so just bearing that in mind, that we shouldn't categorically dismiss maps just because they're quote unquote biased. I'll go ahead and proceed into the first of these considerations. So I've got 5 here that I want to talk about, and I'll kind of go through them one by one with a few examples. Starting with this, that maps are not the same as data, but they can't be made without data, right? So this wonderful little visualization here made by Tess McCann, who did some work with us at the Map Center a couple of years ago, helps us visualize the role of humans in map making. On the left, you've got data, right? A data set or a data table, which is just records of stuff that happened, right? It's just recording instances or observations. On the right, we've got maps, which are these more abstract techniques and tools for visualizing spatial data. The human is always right there in the middle, analyzing and visualizing and helping to bring these maps into being as a way of interpreting the data. It's important to remember here that maps do not equal data, right? A map is not an observation of stuff that happened, but it's an abstraction of those observations. And this is part of what leaves open space for all kinds of misleading creations, whether they're intentionally misleading or not. These maps here made the rounds on Twitter recently. On the left, we've got this map. Both maps show COVID-19 cases per million population. On the left is supposed to be a map of how the year started, and on the right is how it's going. It's hard to see here because Twitter crops out the maps and key parts of the map design on these pictures. So let's go ahead and zoom in. Right. So what are these maps supposed to mean? They're maps of new COVID cases per million population per US state. Based on the colors alone, we're kind of led to believe that the map on the left is more severe, right? Everything is red and nothing is green. So because we intuitively, not universally, but at least in kind of Western map making conventions, we intuitively associate red with bad and green with good. This map is tacitly saying that things are bad. The map on the right, on the other hand, shows many different colors. It suggests variation among new cases and variation among severity. Basically, the problem here is that these maps imply that COVID cases were bad, but aren't anymore, or that COVID cases were high, but aren't anymore. The map maker is using two things to make this argument here that may be pretty clear to some of you, but the two things are classification and color, right, to send this message. So let's start with classification. Data classification is how the map makers decide to bring their data into the visual format of the map. These maps use two different classification schemes. On the left, we've got a 0 to 300 ramp. On the right, we've got a 0 to 1500 ramp. That right there is a sign that should raise some red flags, right? When you're comparing different data sets on maps like these, which are called choropleth maps, it's just quantity by area, basically what that means. You want to try to use the same classification scheme. Otherwise, it's really hard to compare and draw sensible conclusions. I've highlighted the data source in red boxes here just to point out Johns Hopkins makes COVID-19 data available, and so does JP Morgan, but I did a little digging and had a lot of trouble finding exactly what data set this map seemed like it was using. So that's also a little fishy for me. But at any rate, this is so this data here has been classified in ways that are quite problematic, obviously. And more to the point, this is what we call ordinal data, right? Ordinal data is data that can be ranked from low to high. Obviously, COVID cases qualify as such. You rank low to high across space. You typically want to use a sequential color scheme for ordinal data. There are a number of different ways that you can represent data on maps. And with ordinal data, you want to use a sequential scheme, which is a color scheme that just takes one color and varies the shades from low intensities to increasing intensities. Both of these maps use what we call divergent color schemes, which are color schemes that imply some kind of like middle point to the data. Neither of these cases have a meaningful middle point, and more importantly, they're both using different color schemes anyway. We've got this red to blue on one side and a green to red on the other side. All of that together makes these maps extremely confusing. And full disclosure, everyone on Twitter knew that, right? These maps were actually so bad, quite frankly, that they went viral more for the obviousness of their misleading claims and the problems that accompanied the maps. I actually think that maps that are beautiful and very well made can even be a little bit more insidious or hard to track because of their beauty. Because when it comes to cartography, maps that are beautiful can be very convincing, even if they have taken some kind of argument or potentially misleading data to try to speak to the audience in a particular way. So all that to say, data is integral to maps, and so too is how we choose to represent that data. That kind of leads me into the second consideration, that a map is more than the sum of its parts. I'll demonstrate this with this really interesting map from 1922. It's a map by a Hungarian geographer named Paul Teleki. Paul Teleki did something very clever here. Instead of coloring areas based on their dominant ethnicity, this is an ethnographical map of Hungary where each color represents a different ethnic group. Instead of representing areas based on the dominant ethnicity, he colored areas in direct proportion to the total population of each ethnic group. This was a strategic move because the purpose of this map was actually to convince the delegates of the Trianon peace talk after World War I that Hungary should not be divided. By representing the map using these aerial calculations that really pronounce the ethnic Hungarian population, and by coloring that in this bright red, Paul Teleki has made an argument that the country should not be reduced in size, which history shows ultimately it was. But this is what I mean by more than the sum of its parts, right? The map extends into territory that is political and social and makes different kinds of arguments based on various parties that often have conflicting interests. And it's exactly those parts of the map, those things like a legend and a scale bar and classification choices that allow the cartographer to do this. So that brings me to the next point here, right? The parts of the map are still really important, even though the map is more than the sum of its parts. I really love these maps. It's a pair of maps that we had commissioned at the LMEC by a cartographer named Daniel Huffman. On the left, we've got a map arguing that Boston's free Wi-Fi keeps the city quite connected. And on the right, we've got a map that says the opposite. It leaves people disconnected. What's going on here? How is the map maker doing this? Right? To understand, we can take a look at the legend. For the left, for example, we can break into this a little bit. We've only got 3 different data buckets, right? Up to 70%, 70 to 80%, and over 80%. This choice to represent the data in 3 distinct buckets has really important implications for how we actually see the data, right? This kind of artificially inflates the subscription rate by lumping in areas with a 25% connectivity rate with areas that have a 65% connectivity rate, even though intuitively we might think about those rates as very different, right? One of them is pretty low and one of them is kind of high. But representing the data in this way makes them all the same color on the map. So you have to be careful about what these legends are saying and how they're representing data in order to understand what argument the map is making. Pivoting over to this one, right? We have many more breaks in the data now. We've got a legend that uses 6 instead of 3. I kind of want to throw this one back to the crowd and just say, taking a look at these 2 maps, I know they're not, it's kind of, they're compressed a little bit, so the quality isn't super high, but I think Megan has dropped some links in so that you all can take a look at them on our website if you want to. What do you think about why the cartographer chose to add more breaks in the second map? How does this impact the way that we're visualizing the data and what kind of message we take away? I see a comment in the chat that asks if this second map is used to influence gerrymandering. I think that's a really interesting question, right? These maps were made specifically for educational purposes, but I'm sure that if you wanted to take gerrymandering maps and kind of overlay them with different kinds of data like this, you might come to some interesting conclusions or results, right? Let's go ahead and move on here. But the key point that I want to kind of drive home is that the parts of the map, right, the legend, the classification, the color schemes, have great impact on the message and the argument that the map maker is making. Here we go. And the key thing is that we can use these different schemes, right? Color, classification, design, to tell different stories with the same data. And that's why we should always be skeptical and wary when we're not just looking at maps, but looking at all kinds of media, that the same occurrences can happen and we can represent them in very different ways. Bearing that in mind, let's move on to the next thing. Erica talked about this a little bit already, and I just wanted to kind of dig into one of these examples from Anthony Robinson, who she mentioned. So new maps can go viral, right? This case right here is a map on the left. If you have trouble reading it, it's a tweet by a data scientist named Nate Silver, who works at 538. They do a lot of election polling, election mapping. And he says, here's what the election map would look like if only women voted. This is from 2016. And it's quite a stark map because you can see so much blue, right? 458 electoral votes to Clinton, which, as we know, is not what happened. It's a way of kind of speculatively imagining other kinds of alternative events, right? Well, this map got picked up quite massively. And Anthony Robinson, the cartographer that Erica mentioned before, did a little bit of research into this and spent some time collecting different variations on that map that were made afterwards. I think he stopped counting at around 500. You can see on the right, just all of them collected into this one big image, all the maps that people had made on variations of, here's what the map would look like if only X voted, right? One of those maps was this, and I love this map. Or it's not one of those maps, but one of the maps that is kind of discussed in Anthony Robinson's article about that event is this viral map called The Eclipse, Smothered and Covered, the best places to watch the eclipse while eating at Waffle House. This is a map made by a guy named Jerry Shannon, a geographer in Georgia. And it's a map that captures the path of the 2017 solar eclipse, overlaid with Waffle Houses in the path, so that presumably a user can know, here are the locations of a Waffle House if I want to get some good old-fashioned Southern breakfast and see this eclipse. The key point here, and Jerry Shannon talks about this a little bit in different academic articles and news pieces. He says it's a misconception that maps only show what's there. These maps, whether they're old maps or viral maps, also create perceptions of neighborhoods and regions that can shape people's future actions, from where they watch an eclipse to where they buy a house. Right? So these maps aren't just representing things that are actually there. They're producing the world as we know it in a lot of different ways. And this is a sort of idea that is important to divest ourselves of this notion that maps only show what's there. And I think that he does a really good job of articulating that in this quote. But at any rate, these are some of the implications of maps going viral because they are so powerful. But it's not just new maps that go viral. They do have a tendency to go viral, but that process is not necessarily new. I want to take us back to this really cool map. This is in our Bending Lines exhibit. This is a map from the Spanish-American War of 1898. That war coincided with the rise of mass market, profit-seeking newspapers in the United States that were willing to make really wild claims if those exaggerations led to more sales, which, I mean, if that's ringing any bells, kind of sounds like Twitter in a lot of ways, and the ways that maps might get retweeted or circulated widely. This was often called the Yellow Press, and it became a major force in whipping up different kinds of sentiments in the American public, particularly around war. So because the war took place in places that were unfamiliar to many Americans, like the Spanish Empire, for example, maps were important tools for telling the public where battles were taking place. So this map was published in the Boston Evening Record in 1898, excuse me. And it was published in this period between the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana and the U.S. declaration of war on April 21st. Sort of introducing readers right to the Caribbean islands where the war was starting to pick up momentum, and situating how close it really was to a lot of that readership and the coast. So this brings me to my next point, that all maps have bias. And I talked about this a little bit already, but I do want to dig in a little bit more with an example. So this is another map that is, again, the quality gets kind of blown to pieces here, but we have this online as well if you want a deeply zoomable and nicer looking version. It's also up in our exhibition in Bending Lines. So you could come by and take a look at it in person. It's a huge map. It's probably almost the size of my wingspan if I stretched my arms out all the way. It's very busy and full of information, and it features a proposal for 100,000 miles of national highways. This map was from 1918, so those of you, who might reflect on when the national highway system was actually built in the 50s. This was long before that. So it's clearly a lobbying map. It's the vision of a highway lobby group known as the National Highways Association. And it's got all these connections to the auto industry. It's got its fingers in different state and local governments. This National Highways Association was a straightforward lobbying group for the car lobby and to build a national highway network. In this map, what you might have trouble seeing in terms of the text, but is very clear with the symbolism, is that the National Highways Association has wrapped their agenda in the mantle of patriotism. The map itself is pretty generic. It's just showing this outline of the U.S. crisscrossed by highways. But the text of the map makes a very persuasive argument that road building is intimately linked with preparedness for different kinds of war efforts. And ultimately, if you look at later highway maps, when the international highway system or the national highway system was finally built, it was in fact a defense project. So just because maps like that have bias doesn't mean that maps can't be trusted at all. And this brings me back to a very foundational point, that all maps have to begin from a point of bias. And I think that this little animation does a good job of demonstrating that. So this is something called projection face. It's a little tool that we made at the LMEC to visualize what the human head would look like if projected on different map projections. The fundamental problem of geography and map making is to take a round object, the Earth, and try to display it on a flat surface. That can't be done without stretching, inflating some things, deflating other things, making some things bigger and making other things smaller. And just to, to put that in a context that is very evocative and clear, we can see it happening on this human head. So this is not to say that, that maps, that maps, all this is not to say that maps can't be trusted categorically, but that the bias that's inside maps is important to understand as a map reader, as you make your own evaluations about what you should and shouldn't trust. So also this is, I think Megan has dropped this in the chat as well. And there are tons of different projections that you can play around with. I've gotten lost in this little tool before, and I hope that some of you all do too. The last thing that I want to talk about here is, here we go. I'm going to skip over that one for time. I see we're kind of pushing it, but this is just a really cool map of the world that we've actually got laid out on the floor in front of the Leventhal Center. So come by and we'll tell you all about it tomorrow. The last thing here is that maps take place. And I've got that in scare quotes because I mean it two ways, right? Maps always show something happening somewhere. But maps also are a technique for claiming territory, for literally taking place. And this example, this map by John Smith is a great example of that. It's a very early map from the early 17th century of colonial New England, called New England, the most remarkable parts thus named by the high and mighty Prince Charles. That part thus named is really important here. John Smith's map, this is, again, an early settler colonial map. When he first drafted this, he brought it back to Prince Charles, and Prince Charles said, "This won't do." John Smith had written down and marked all the place names in the original indigenous Algonquian. Prince Charles said, no, no, no. Scratch those names out. We're going to put good, proper English names on the map instead. And that's how you end up with places like London and Oxford and Portsmouth on this map. When those places didn't actually describe a community that called itself that, or a place that existed as Oxford, these were indigenous settlements, if there was any settlement there at all. But this was an important way of articulating ownership, right? That's communicated through the map. And that's what I mean by taking place. That doesn't always have to be a thing that's wrapped up in settler colonialism. There are all sorts of ways that we can use maps like this to take place in ways that are empowering and productive. And again, that's what makes maps so powerful. This is another example from our exhibit, a more modern and digital example of contested territory. On the left here, we've got a view of the Kashmir region from India. On the right, it's a view of the same place, but the IP address that you would use to look at this map on your computer or your phone is different. On the left, it's what it looks like in India. On the right, it's what it looks like in Pakistan. And you can see that on the right, you've got these dotted lines that are not there in the Indian version. That's because the territory is contested. And depending on who is looking at the map, depending on what kind of audience it is, Google Maps has cleverly adjusted the representation of these lines in accordance with who they think, what they think the audience would like to see. I want to take a minute here. I'd love to get some comments from the crowd. What do you think this map is? This is a map, I promise. Go ahead and drop in the chat if you have any guesses of what you think this map is representing. I'd love to see. I know someone has an idea out there. I'm cognizant of time, so I do want to leave space open for a Q&A at the end. Boats in the harbor, that's a wonderful guess. I love it. Yeah, maybe one of these little dots is a boat in the harbor. Ooh, growth of mold. I like that, especially with the way that the dots kind of spread out, almost like they've been pressed on with a brush or something. In a petri dish, a heat map of population, snowstorms in Maine. Love it. Cell phone signals. Ooh, I love that so many of these examples sort of follow from the design of the map, right? Cell phone signals are kind of ethereal. Touches on a phone are very ephemeral. These are things that don't necessarily have bounded geography all of the time. These are wonderful guesses. None of them are exactly correct. This is a map of streetlights from a neighborhood of this cartographer who made an atlas with a bunch of different maps of his neighborhood called Everything Sings. And the idea behind this atlas was to remove those typical conventions of maps like legends and titles and scale bars, sort of disassociating the topic from those, historical conventions of map making. I really like this as an example of the power of maps, because if we look at this without being told that it's a map, it just kind of looks like a bunch of dots, right? But when we're told it's a map, we immediately start to link it to a place. We imagine that it is Dennis Wood, Will, yes. Dennis Wood is actually quite a controversial cartographer. I'd be happy to talk more about that if people have questions. He was, I don't know. I really like this map, but he is, sort of a controversial figure in the world of cartography. But at any rate, so I think that this is a great way of looking at how when you map something onto space, when you call it a geography, suddenly it's infused with a different kind of meaning than just sort of absent dots. I have another example of this before I go away. If you know the answer to this one, don't say it, but go ahead and if you don't know what this is, I'd love to see some more guesses. So what do you all think these dots are? What do we think this map is representing? Any guesses? I'll go ahead and move through because I do want to give Erica a little bit of time to wrap up here too. This is just 700 red dots on a map. This website called ClickHoles, it's sort of like The Onion. They make fun of different kinds of clickbait articles on the internet, and they say some statistics can be so unbelievable or deal with concepts so vast that it's impossible to wrap our heads around them. That's why we put 700 red dots on a map. With the Dennis Wood map, we've got this very ambiguous geography, this very ambiguous data set that is meaningless until we assign a geography to it. This map, on the other hand, is a geography, begins with a geography that has no actual meaning to it, but we're able to say, oh, is it Dunkin' locations? Is it post offices? Maybe it's a map of population, something like that. Nope, it's just nothing, but we assign it meaning because it takes place, because it happens in a geography. And that's really one of the things that makes maps so powerful. And it's why we should be cognizant and skeptical of that power, even though we can still love and enjoy maps while doing so. I think I'll actually skip through these little tips. Maybe I can go through them later, but I know that we only have 10 minutes left and I want to leave some time. I've probably given you enough so far. I do have this little thing on the right here. It's another app that we made at the LMEC that I think Megan may drop in the chat. It is a little tool for evaluating how much you trust this map, and then it'll tell you what other people thought, and whether the crowd kind of thought it was trustworthy. I think that brings it back to you, Erica. I'll go ahead and pass it over to kind of bring us back to verifying maps, and then we can get into a Q&A here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ian. That was all such helpful information for critically reading maps. So I just wanted to end our time here today. I love helpful kind of tips that you can take as you go out and encounter maps, as you most likely will very soon. So here are a few different things that are some recommendations for tips for verifying maps. While these are map specific in the examples, these are really great building blocks just for consuming media in general, especially in social media and in the media as well. So the first and foremost, the first one, examine the map source. Source here can mean a variety of different things. If you see a map on social media, you take a look at you can take a look at the sharing source. So who is the person who is sharing the account, the map? Do you recognize the source? And, by hovering over that person's profile, that's really easy to do on Twitter. But if you're on Instagram, you can go to their profile, asking yourself what are their credentials? How would this person know about this information? But also the source means, where did the data come from? As Ian mentioned in a variety of different of his examples about asking about the sources of those of data. And many of these answers you can't determine by looking at social media posts alone. So that is kind of where lateral reading skills can really help here. The lateral reading method was created by Sam Weinberg and his team at the Stanford History Education Group. And it's a really helpful verification process that requires people to hop off the piece of information that they're consuming and literally open tabs up in their browser and do some additional research about the information that you're consuming. This will kind of lead us into some of those points later. As a little plug, I do teach workshops about this lateral reading method. I'm currently working on scheduling one soon, so if you're ever interested and want to get on the waiting list or want to be alerted, feel free to send me an email. I'll drop it in later. The second tip that you can take is conducting a reverse image search. Megan will drop into the chat a helpful article on how to do that. And this can help for a variety of different reasons. By doing a quick search, you can see where a map or another piece of media, especially images, have appeared on the internet. It can also help you trace back the image to its original source, and that way you can learn a little bit more context about what is happening around that image. This can be really helpful because, as we know, maps often are simplified, and sometimes it's really hard to get the context just from a particular tweet or on social media or even, Reddit and that sort of thing. And the third kind of tip is to consult other sources. And other sources can be news articles, these can be industry discussions, or also fact checking sites. Fact checking sites are great because they kind of do the research for you, and that can alert you to any misinformation that is surrounding maps that might be going viral. This can also help as you consult more sources to get context, nuance, and analysis. Another tip is to read through social media comments. I must admit, sometimes the comment sections on posts and articles can oftentimes be a scary place, but this can also be really helpful to as the first step you can take in verification to see if there are any conversations around that map. The COVID map that Ian shared was a really great example. There was lots of great comments and commentary in the comment section kind of discussing that map. While we're talking about social media, I just want to say a good thing to remember is that high engagement metrics on surrounding a piece of media does not mean automatically mean accuracy or that information in question is accurate. As we saw from a lot of those examples that I went over earlier, a lot of those viral misinformation maps did have really high engagement. I don't have time to talk about it, but then the way that social media is kind of structured with algorithms and how that delivers information to you can also really kind of affect the way that engagement happens too. And finally, I just wanted to kind of one final thought. This might be really simple and really basic, but never underestimate, especially when we're talking about viral information, to pause, to take a breath, and to take your time while looking at the map. And hopefully you can go through some of the tools and conversations and points that we talked about here today as you consume those maps. So that is it on my end as well. I know we just have 5 more minutes left on our time here today. But.
Yeah. Megan, do you have anything that you want to say as we segue into the Q&A?
I don't have much to add. I even learned a lot, and I work with these maps every day. So thank you both for covering such an expansive range of topics and so informative, and I'm glad we were able to touch on all of this. We did receive some questions as you were both talking, so I'll read a few of them off, and then maybe we can, if folks want to add others while I'm going through them, please feel free to drop them in the chat boxes of either Facebook or YouTube. The first one is asking if there are any sort of international overarching bodies that verify or distribute reputable maps. So are there places where we should always be looking for those sources? Is there someone that we can always go to trust, or do we have to constantly be thinking of the tips that you mentioned, Ian?
That's a great question, and it's got a hard answer. I mean, a lot of the maps that we looked at today that are full of bias come from quite authoritative sources. part of the, so one example that I didn't get the chance to talk about, but there have been some really interesting threads on Twitter, kind of, and again, Twitter, be careful on Twitter and all sorts of different ways, but there's some really interesting discourse that can happen there. And so there have been a bunch of really interesting threads about maps on the current invasion of Ukraine, kind of discussing the ways that maps are so commonly used to depict and help understand the context of this crisis. And sometimes those maps accidentally reinforce, narratives that they might not mean to. The maps that are doing that come from, generally well esteemed news organizations, places like the New York Times and the BBC. So all that to say, I think that basically a key takeaway here is that some sources definitely are more trustworthy than others, but just because a map says that it has authority doesn't really mean that you should automatically trust it. So I think that you should be skeptical and critical of all kinds of maps that you see. Although I'm sure there might be like some international body that exists. If there is, I don't know of it. But yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, definitely something to think about, especially when there's so much international conflict going on and who we can look to and what we have to be thinking about. Definitely. There's one more question about the lessons we've learned today. Are those also applicable to graphs, to other data visualizations, or are these solely limited when looking at maps?
That's another great question. And I saw someone said this seems equally applicable to reading graphs. In a lot of ways, I think it is. In some ways, I think that last point that I tried to make might distinguish it a little bit, that we don't necessarily have emotional attachments to graphs. Some people might. I don't want to speak for everyone, but because some graphs and data visualizations can be really beautiful and very, you can build attachments to them in all sorts of different ways. But typically we associate emotions with place, and that's part of the thing that makes maps so distinctly persuasive, in my opinion, at least. I don't know if Erica, you feel free to chime in too. I don't want to kind of dominate this part of the Q&A if you have thoughts here.
No, I think you hit on really great points.
Then there's a follow-up question about this authoritative or overarching bodies. If you could choose, and maybe we shouldn't even choose because it's so hard to say, but is there a person or corporation that's considered the most trustworthy map maker? And for me, this is tough because I would think of Google Maps. That's something I use every day. But as you mentioned, Ian, even Google Maps has to either say or include certain information and leave other information out depending on where you're looking at the data. So for me personally, I cannot think of an overarching considered the most trustworthy. It's so tricky.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, Megan. And I'll actually, Morgan makes a great comment. For example, Indigenous communities vehemently disagree with many, quote, authoritative maps. There's a great website called native-land.ca that tracks the boundaries of Indigenous territories and nations. And you can kind of click a point on the map and see what the overlapping, thank you, Megan, what the overlapping boundaries are on this map as another way of conceptualizing statehood and sovereignty, outside of the kind of, we might say that the USGS is an authoritative map maker, which in many ways it is, but it also is producing a different kind of knowledge than what Indigenous communities might understand as authoritative. And even that is like wildly reductive to say Indigenous communities, because there are all kinds of diverse geographic knowledges that vary from one community to another. So again, it's very hard to say that there's like the most authoritative, but rather that authority is kind of a moving target that we always have to be critically evaluating. I see Eric has asked a question, will bending lines be available in digital format after tomorrow? And it absolutely will be. It's not going anywhere. You can find bending lines online at leventhalmap.org. and anytime, and for the foreseeable future. And I'll also take this moment just to mention for the folks who are still here, I know we're a little bit over time now, that we do have another exhibition coming up after Bending Lines. Bending Lines comes down on the 4th, tomorrow, and while we're very sorry to see it go, we're excited to install More or Less in Common, which is our next exhibition starting on March 18th, and it's about environmental justice and climate justice, taking examples in Boston and New England, but across the world, really, to think through these urgent questions around climate change and environmental equity. So put that on your calendars. We'd love to see you there.
Definitely, yeah. If there are no more questions, I think this is probably a good time to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And if you could do us one favor, we did put together a little, I guess we'll call it a little survey, so you can gauge, I guess, what you liked about tonight's program, what you didn't like, what you'd like to see more of in the future, so that we can put more of these on in the time to come. But yeah, I just want to say thank you, everyone. This was great.
Yeah. Also, I want to shout out Erica. Thank you so much for helping us work on this program and being so willing to kind of dive into maps and the media. It was really fun to put together, and such a pleasure to join forces for this. So
same here as well. And hopefully we can do some of these in the future.
Yeah.
Moving forward.
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah.
Have a
Thank
good
you,
night,
everyone.
everyone.
Have a good evening.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.